Okay. Great. So welcome to our 2019 Community Development Block Grant Training. My name is Jessica Hayes. I'm the CDBG and Federal Program Specialist for HCD. Really quickly, a little bit about me. I've been here since November of last year, but I've been working in CDBG for about a decade, and I worked as a consultant for a long time, working up and down the state with a bunch of different agencies, helping them kind of resolve their problems either through entitlement agencies or through non-entitlement agencies. We'll talk a lot about what the terms are, but that's just kind of my background. So I have a pretty diverse background when it comes to federal programs and it comes to just the information that we're going to be talking about. This is CDBG 101 for non-entitlement. Really what we're going to be talking about in this very first session is the terminology and the base underlying framework of how the program works. So we do this part first so you get kind of a good foundation, so when we move into the redesign and the program income sessions, it makes more sense and we can talk a little bit in shorthand because there are so many terms, so many acronyms, so many rules, so many regulations. So we do this part first just to set some foundation. Please ask questions if you have a question, and I'll do my best to repeat the question back to you and then I'll answer it to make sure that I'm answering the right question. The other thing is I talk fast, especially when I'm excited. So, and I find this all very exciting. So if I'm talking too fast, flag me down, ask me to restate something, ask me to slow down, and I will do that. It's just that it's not nerves or anything, I just get excited and yay! So we'll go ahead and jump into it. So what is CDBG? So Community Development Block Grant is federal funding managed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So they're the agency that provides the funding. It's based on the Housing and Community Development Act, the HCD Act in 1974, although the state programs didn't actually come into being until 1981. So this is a program with a lot of history to it. It's been around for a really long time. It's got a fairly robust set of regulations, rules, and statutes to it. In order to participate in the CDBG program, projects, programs, fundings need to meet one of three national objectives: a benefit to low and moderate income persons, prevention or elimination of slums and blight, or meeting a need having particular urgency. So we'll call that urgent need. I'm going to get into a lot of this in much more detail in a little bit, but this is just kind of the start. There's two flavors really of CDBG. There's your entitlement flavor, and your entitlement flavor are jurisdictions that work directly with HUD for their funding. So they get their funding in a direct allocation from HUD, they sign their grant agreements with HUD, they work with HUD, they have a HUD rep that helps them through their projects. Typically, in order to qualify to be an entitlement, you've got to have at least 50,000 people in a city, at least 200,000 people in a county. But even then, you know, to be an entitlement, you really need to have a certain set of conditions that makes it so that you get enough money to manage an entitlement, because managing CDBG is fairly complicated. The state program was put together in 1981, as I mentioned, to help the rest of the communities that didn't meet that entitlement criteria, support them in their community development needs, right? This federal funding, so this was really something to help make sure that the other jurisdictions also could get a bite of the apple. So the non-entitlement program is mostly focused on rural areas and small towns. If you notice kind of our map of where we were doing our CDBG training, you know, we started out in Sacramento, we had a pretty big group. We went up to Redding, we had a good group up there. We were down in Visalia, then we were in Arcata, then we were down in El Centro. So we stayed really where most of the non-entitlement jurisdictions are. In the Bay Area, most of those jurisdictions are entitlement. Down in Southern California, most of those jurisdictions are entitlement. You know, in the LA, San Diego area. So really, this program is for jurisdictions that don't meet those criteria. It's set up, the state has quite a bit of leeway in how the state designs its programs. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is the federal stuff, and we're going to talk about that because the state has a current goal to align with the federal requirements. So we're working very hard to take our state program and align it as much as possible to the federal program to make it easier for our grantees to access resources, because the federal program has a really robust set of resources. So what kinds of things can you do with CDBG? There's really 5 types of projects. You can do a public services project, you can do a public infrastructure or public facility project, you can do an economic development project, you can do a housing assistance project, or you can do a planning project. And they each have a different set of criteria and a different set of regulations that kind of tell you how you need to manage those projects. We're going to get into this a lot more detail when we get into our national objective conversation, but this is one of the most versatile and flexible funding sources available in the grant world, especially out of the federal grant. So this particular program gives jurisdictions a wide range of latitude in what kinds of projects can be funded, as long as they meet the criteria. There are a couple of rules that we need to pay careful attention to when we're administering CDBG. The first one are the federal spending caps. So there's 2 federal spending caps in the CDBG program. There's your public services spending cap and there's your planning and admin spending cap. The way that CDBG was originally written into statute, it was intended to be a capital, mostly a capital resource, capital funding for capital projects. It really wasn't intended initially to be a public service resource. Public services are allowed, but there's a 15% cap, which means 15% of the money can be budgeted for public services. And then this is super important. In any given year, only 15% of the total expenditures are eligible for public services. So you got to both plan it on the front end, and then you've got to actually expend it on the back end when you're working on your caps. Same thing with planning and administration. So there's a 20% cap on planning and administration. So you can spend up to 20% of your total money, but if you spend any more than that, you have to pay it back to HUD, and we'll talk about that more also. Then there's also the state set-aside. So the state has 4 set-asides in statute. The 30%, the first set-aside is 30%, so 30% of the money received on an annual allocation has to be set aside for economic development. That's in state statute. 51% needs to be set aside for housing or activities that support housing. That one's tricky. We're going to talk about why in a bit. 5% may be set aside for colonias along the southern border. That's the state's response to a federal requirement that up to 10% can be set aside for colonias. The state of California sets aside 5% because we really only have colonias in Imperial County. And then 1.5% can be set aside for non-federally recognized Native American tribes. And if you've looked at our NOFAs before, you've probably seen this in there. This is something that's been pretty much a standard for the state programs for a long time. So this whole section that we're going to talk about right now, this is the state's responsibility. This is what we do. But we feel it's important to make sure that our grantees understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that they can understand what their role is and why their role is so important. Because your role really is very important in whether or not these programs are successful. So planning and reporting. There are kind of a couple layers of plans that support the federal programs, including CDBG, and then there's a specialized kind of report that has to go out. So the big plan is your consolidated plan, and that's a 5-year plan that says over the next 5 years, here's how we're going to use the money to help address community needs and goals. And there's 5 chapters to your consolidated plan. There's your public outreach, which is the very first step. And if you guys have seen what we have up on the website, we've been doing focus groups on housing and homelessness and public services. Those focus groups are there to help support our consolidated plan. We also have an open survey on our website available for anyone who wants to take it. Again, intended to identify needs through that public outreach component. You take the information that you get from all of that public outreach, and then you compare it to the data provided mostly by HUD, but also pulled out of the U.S. Census. And that's your needs assessment. So you say, okay, here's what we got from the public, and here's what the data's saying, and you do a comparison. And then you take that analysis and you do a next layer analysis, your market analysis, where you say, here's our resources, here's our economic opportunities, here's our economic gaps, here's what we've got going on, right? And you take all of that information and you use it to develop a strategic plan. So your strategic plan is the 5-year plan that says, here's how we're actually going to use the money in the next 5 years. Here's our 5-year goals. Here's the big objectives that we have. And then that breaks down into an annual action plan. And each year there's a new annual action plan that says, in this year, we're going to take this chunk towards those 5-year goals. We're gonna focus on these projects, right? All of that gets reported up in what's called the Consolidated Annual Performance Evaluation Report. In short term is the CAPER. So that report says on each year, here's how much progress you've made towards those goals that you set up in your strategic plan. And this is the report that really dictates whether or not the federal programs are being run successfully, because it tracks everything from expenditures to beneficiaries to project progress reports. It really lets us know whether or not we're doing what we said we were going to do in that strategic plan. And a lot of the reporting requirements that the state asks for, not all of them, but a lot of them, are to feed into this CAPER so that we have good information, so that we can report back to HUD saying, here's how good we're doing with our money, or here's where we have really big challenges, which is important to kind of keep track of. So we're going to talk a little bit about the project cycle. So now that you know kind of what's on the state's end, you know, we do that mostly in the background with the exception of public outreach. But when we're actually looking at what we're going to be doing over a grant cycle year, there's really 10 steps. So there's the notice of funding availability. We release that. Eligible cities and counties submit an application. Applications are reviewed, rated, ranked, and awarded funding. And then we do a standard agreement. And the standard agreement is the contract that sets the terms and conditions for the use of the funds. It should also include your scope, your milestones, and your budget. In the past, some of our standard agreements have been a little weak. Some have been a little more weak. Moving forward, we're going to have a much more structured standard agreement style that will include specific milestones, budgets, scopes of work, national objectives, to help provide clarity for everyone. And we're going to talk more about that in the redesign section. Once you've got your standard agreement, you can start work on your eligible activities. And when you guys are all ready to start work, we are informing HUD. You know, HCD starts informing HUD of what's going to be happening that year with that funding. You report on progress, request funds, we reimburse, we pay you, and then we reimburse from HUD. And then when you're all done, you submit your final accomplishments. You say, here's what we did, here's how much we spent, and here's how many people we helped. And the how many people we helped is the super important part. And then we do a final report out to HUD and then close the whole thing down. So really, here's kind of the different relationships in the federal program. So when you're talking about your funding authority, the funding authority for the program comes from HUD. HCD is the middleman, and the reason we're the middleman is because, as we mentioned, CDBG has a lot of rules and regulations. It's been around a while. So it can be fairly complex to administer. It requires quite a bit of capacity, especially if you're going, you know, if you're ever administered or dealt with an entitlement. They get 20% of their total allocation each year to use on planning and admin. That's kind of an admittance that there's quite a bit of planning and admin that has to happen. So HCD takes on a bulk of that planning and admin for grantees in the state program. So that's why HCD, we're really the middleman when it comes to authority, and then local government is the recipient. But when you're talking about performance responsibility, the performance is really driven by the local governments. HCD is still the middleman, right? And then the final reporting, the final reports and all of the information needs to go to HUD because they're the ones who started the whole thing. And I'm going to say a few things a couple times, but one of my favorite things is HUD's money, HUD's the rules. We're going to use their rules because it's their money, but it really is. So they're the funding authority, but then they're also the final recipient of the data that we receive from you guys to talk about performance. All right, so we're going to get into national objectives. This is really the meat of the CDBG program. It's how the national objectives work. So every CDBG activity except funding administration must meet a national objective. If it doesn't, we have to pay the money back to HUD. Right? If you spend money on an activity and it doesn't end up meeting a national objective, the money has to go back to HUD. It's in federal statute. Program applicants, when you're thinking about what kind of an activity you might want to do, national objective should play a really big part in your consideration because that's going to determine how difficult it is to report on, how difficult it is to administer, how much effort you need to plan to actually make your activity be successful. There are a lot of activities where you can have multiple national objectives. And when you're thinking about your activity, you want to say, okay, so I can do this a couple of different ways. Which way is going to be the most effective and efficient for me? And we can help you with that conversation, especially as we're working through the redesign and working through some of the new guidelines set up for the program to help make sure that you're looking at things the most effective way. Because really our goal for you is to have a program be successful. We don't want to set it up so that it's so hard to administer that you end up fighting too much nature, and burning through money, or worse, not spending money because you can't quite get your objectives in order. And one of the handouts, here, let me grab it real quick. Is this on this tiny little print? It's all of these different line items. And we're going to post this online for you also, but the most, I would always, if you were wanting to kind of keep abreast of this document, pull it down from HUD because they update it fairly regularly. But it's the list of national objectives for activities that are eligible under CDBG. And you'll notice there's a lot of them. There's a lot of things you can do. But then it tells you which ways you have to report. And we're going to get into this part next, the different types of reporting. So of the 3 national objectives, benefit to low and moderate income persons is by far the most common. So this is the one that we're going to spend the most time on. We'll talk about all 3, but we're going to talk a lot about this one. So basically what the benefit to low and moderate income persons is that persons' households, people participating or receiving benefit from activities funded through CDBG have to meet HUD's low and moderate income requirements. And that means that they need to typically meet the 80% of HUD-adjusted median family income. It's called HAMFI. Sometimes you'll hear the short term AMI. That's not really what it is. AMI is a census term. HAMFI is a HUD-adjusted data. So it's typically, if you go to pull your AMI right out of Fact Finder on the US Census, you're not going to get the same number as you're going to get if you look at what HUD's adjusted median family income is. And there's various reasons for that, but the HUD adjustment is really there to make sure that we're capturing the correct population when we're doing our services.
They update it once a year, is that correct?
They do update it once a year, yeah. And it's provided in a couple of different formats. HCD, we've been trying to make sure that we provide it in a user-friendly format. And we're going to talk a lot more about how that works when we get to the area benefit. Yeah?
Is low and extremely low? Low and below, or just low?
So the question was, are there the different kind of categories of low income? So there are multiple categories, and we're going to talk about that in like 3 slides. But what HUD is really mostly concerned about is the 80% of HAMFI. So that's really the threshold. And we'll talk about how the different income categories in just a moment. The second bullet here is actually very important. So at least 70% of all CDBG funding, not counting your general administration, must be used to meet the low and moderate income objective. And it's very important to keep that in mind. That's a federal statute, that's a requirement. We'll talk about why in just a second. Slums and blight. So this is one of the other 3 national objectives. So an activity can be used in the aid or prevention of slums and blight. There's an important thing that needs to be noted, though, if you're thinking about using slums and blight as a national objective. And that is, you've got to declare an area slummed or blighted before you go in for your application. You can't do it after you've applied for funding. And it needs to be a public declaration, usually a resolution. And if you think about what that means, if you're identifying a neighborhood as slummed and blighted, CDBG is intended to be mostly used for residential neighborhoods. Most residential property owners are not very excited about having their neighborhood declared slummed and blighted by resolution through the city council or through the county board of supervisors. They don't like that. Individual property owners are equally generally not as excited about having a spot, having their parcel identified as slummed and blighted. So it can be a very politically challenging declaration to make, which is why slums and blight doesn't get used very often. Usually, not always, but usually, if you are trying to do something that qualified as slums and blight, it will probably meet an LMI objective also. And this is one of the things to kind of remember. You know, if you've got a neighborhood that's really struggling with deterioration, it's probably pretty typical that that neighborhood is also very low income. So you can have some overlap there. Yeah?
So coming out of the entitlement world, this is typically used when you've got a property, when there's been like a disaster, and you need to do debris removal and cleanup, or you have like a historic property that is in imminent danger, so that you're just declaring it around those kinds of activities. It's not really meant to do target area redevelopment because, again, as you said, that's an LMI activity.
Correct, yeah. And we're going to talk about urgent need because that's the other one. But yes, slums and blight is not needed very often. Usually there's another alternative. So the final national objective we're going to talk about is urgent need. So urgent need is really focused on disaster-related activities. If you go look up kind of HUD's guidance on this, I think they use an earthquake and a hurricane as an example, right? So they're talking about big disasters. Now, it doesn't just have to be a big disaster. There's a lot of natural disasters or unforeseen disasters that can cause, that are good cause for urgent need. But urgent need really is intended to be used as that response for disaster-related or things that have come up unforeseen. Urgent need needs to be used pretty close to the timing of the disaster that caused it. So, you know, if you have a fire 10, 15 years ago, you don't really have an urgent need, right? You're kind of past that point. Urgent need does not need to meet that low and moderate income requirement. So it doesn't count necessarily against that LMI 70%, which is something that's why that 70% is super important, because the only way you can use urgent need is if you are meeting well above that 70% minimum low LMI accomplishment. So I've got kind of an example in here on this last bullet. If 90% of your CDBG funding is meeting a low and moderate income category, right, low and moderate income national objective, then you've got some margin. You've got 20% margin for your funding to be used for urgent need. If you don't know how much money is being used to meet low and moderate income national objective, you don't know whether or not you have margin. And the only way that the state knows whether or not we have margin to use urgent need is if we are regularly receiving beneficiary reports from our grantees. So this ties us back to that slide where we had our funding authority and then our performance responsibility. You know, if we don't know where we are at any given time in our performance responsibility, we have no idea whether or not we have any headroom to meet an urgent need, which can make it much more difficult for the program to be responsive in the cases of disaster. And we've had no lack of disasters in the state of California the last couple of years. So this reporting requirement that's on grantees, it's so important, right? Because that tells us whether or not we have the ability to be responsive in the event of a disaster or an emergency. So we're going to spend the next chunk of time talking about the low and moderate income breakdown and really how the different pieces work in that. So if you looked at that handout, you'll notice that there's a lot of national objectives on that handout. But in reality, for low mod, there's really 4 types, right? And all of the other sub-national objectives fit into those 4 types. So you've got your low mod limited clientele, and that objective is a per person tracked objective. You've got your low mod area benefit, and that objective is tracked by census data. If you don't have the census data, then there's a survey involved. We'll talk about that in a minute. The next objective is your low and moderate housing, and that one is defined by household income. It's tracked very similarly to the clientele, but it's a little bit different because it does look at the whole entire household. And then you have your low and moderate job creation and retention activities, and these are typically your economic development activities. And they track jobs, really. How many full-time jobs are you providing with your funding? So talking about the low and moderate income clientele, so persons who earn 80% or less of the HUD adjusted median family income, that's the HAM fee, can qualify for low and moderate limited clientele services. There's 3 different categories on here. You've got your low, your very low, and your extremely low. Those are the types, that's the level of data that you're required to track at when you're tracking low and moderate income. So you'll need to be able to have some way of tracking income data. There's a whole category of folks that are presumed benefit by HUD. And presumed benefit means that typically these folks earn so little money that they automatically qualify as low income. A lot of them are on fixed incomes. A lot of them are also, just disadvantaged in the job market. So kind of the list of folks, there's your seniors, persons with a disability, persons experiencing homelessness. You've got your domestic violence victims, illiterate adults, persons living with AIDS, migrant farm workers. What's really important to note is that just because you may be serving a population that is presumed benefit, that doesn't mean you don't have to still track their data. So you still have to track data, even if you're serving a presumed benefit population. So if you're going to be working on a low and moderate income clientele type of national objective project, then there's a couple of pieces of data that you're going to need to track on. Race, ethnicity, and income are universal, right? You're going to be tracking race, ethnicity, and income for pretty much every single one of your national objectives except area benefit. Depending on what kind of a service you're providing, it may be necessary for you to track on a couple of other data points. So you may need to track on household size. You may need to track on whether or not there's a female head of household or a senior head of household, or whether or not the household includes a disabled family member. So different activities require different metrics, different tracking. When you're tracking on limited clientele, it's really important to remember that you got to get that information from every single person who receives a unit of service. For some services, that's easy, right? You have a form and they fill it out and it's very simple. For other services, it can be a lot harder. And so when you're looking at what you're going to be doing with your activity, you want to make sure that you set up enough bandwidth in your project setup to make sure that you have the capacity to track the information necessary to make the project successful. So talking about low and moderate area benefit, so this particular national objective uses census geography as kind of the boundaries. And what it's typically, like kind of the baseline is that at least 51.1% of households in the area must be at 80% of HAMP fee or less. That's kind of the baseline for area benefit. The area that you're serving, it's got to be contiguous, so there can't be donut holes and there can't be cherry picking. You've got to make sure that you've got your entire area kind of as a contiguous solidified area. And then the activity should be a public benefit activity. So, some easy examples are street crossings, street improvements, sewer and water improvements. Like these are things that actually are public goods that assist the public. There are some very, very key challenges that face jurisdictions participating in the non-entitlement program through the state. And one of them is the ACS, so American Community Survey, is the data tool that's used now to track on census data and to identify what are the kind of the trends, what are the changes. It's the base data for the HAMP fee data. The American Community Survey, the way that it kind of works is it does a sample of different jurisdictions. It does an annual sample and then it aggregates those samples into 3- and 5-year chunks. And the state of California and HUD uses the 5-year chunks for almost everything. For big, populous, dense areas, they get a lot of samples, so their data tends to be pretty good. For smaller jurisdictions, they don't get so many samples, and so it doesn't take very many responses to skew your data. You've had a couple of new houses built in the last 5 years, they've got slightly higher income residents, and all of a sudden, your data has flopped, and you are no longer now as a jurisdiction 51.1% low mod. Now you're 49.9% low mod, right? Because you've had maybe 3 or 4 sample differences. So it can be a very big challenge for small jurisdictions, for leaders of small jurisdictions or for smaller cities and counties to make sure that they actually are getting the service needs that their community, the service response, the service support that their community needs. One way to do that is through an income survey. So if you strongly suspect, you're looking at the new data, and we've got some pretty good tools that HUD's producing to help pinpoint at the census block group level what the income data is, and we're going to be sharing more information about that very soon when we start to do more training on income surveys. But if you've got a pretty good idea that, this 10-unit development is skewing your entire income balance because, it's been there for 5 years and there's enough, somebody's taken a sample or a survey from the ACS sample, you can do an income survey to identify a specific target group, target area for income eligibility. You have to it requires a very high level of data. Your data has to be good. That's what I'm trying to say. So your data has to be really good. In CPD Notice 1902, which came out back in like February, March, upped the data requirements for this particular activity, for income surveys. So HUD now says, if you're going to do an income survey, that's fine. Here's the data requirements you have to meet. And the expectation is that your survey is going to be as good or better than the data validity of the American Community Survey, which is sometimes, the American Community Survey can have up to a 29% margin of error, which is huge, especially for a small jurisdiction. So you have to be better than that. HUD's expectation is that your income survey will have a 10% margin of error. That's a very low margin of error for an income survey. So we're going to be doing more conversations about what's involved in that, but if you need to do an income survey, talk with us sooner rather than later so that we can help make sure that you set it up so that it's effective and so that you don't spend money that you don't need to spend, or so that you don't have to do an income survey twice. Yeah?
Will you accept income surveys that are 1 to 2 years old and are based on like the California SRF standards?
The California what?
State revolving fund standards?
So California doesn't have a state revolving fund. Oh, not HCD, you're talking about
I'm
like
talking about for state.
for the water and
Yeah, water
the disadvantaged communities.
Because we've done that at 2 of our communities, and they're the ones who we would be applying for.
So the question is whether or not we could accept a survey for from a different state agency to use as an income survey. It really depends as to whether or not the survey meets HUD's minimum requirements. Each of the agencies that do income surveys have slightly different standards, and a lot of the standards where HUD has deviation from the different types of surveys has to do with how the public is informed, and how many times the public is contacted, and then how the data is actually collected. Because there's a couple of different collection methods, and some have been shown to skew data. So we would need to have a conversation about your methodology, your write-up, and how much background you had. Typically, surveys are good for about 5 years, but with HUD's change in survey expectations, we're going to be really needing to look at those surveys very carefully to make sure that they meet the requirements, or that if they don't meet the requirements, that we can justify using that data moving forward. Yes?
I consult with a couple small cities, and they'll say to me when we're talking about CDBG eligible activities, well, we're an economically disadvantaged community. I'm not familiar with that process to become designated as such, but have you guys run across that, and is that in any way tied to meeting a national objective, or should my response be, that's different?
So the question is, how does the disadvantaged communities the economically disadvantaged communities compare to with HUD's? So I have been in the exact same shoes when I was a consultant, and the answer is they do not overlap. So the disadvantaged communities standard is a state standard, and it's different.
Looking at different things.
It's looking at different things. Now, if you're a disadvantaged community, the odds are really good that you're going to meet the low mod area benefit requirements, provided you haven't had that survey skewed issue with the ACS. If you have, you may need to redo an income survey. But typically, in actuality, they are a lot of the same. But you can't say that your DAC status makes means that you're low mod, because that's not the data that HUD tracks on. And what's really important is when we're putting our data in for HUD, for that CAPER, it has to meet the data fields that they've established. So if we don't meet their data fields, then it makes it very difficult for us to report on that activity. The activity may be deemed ineligible because it's not meeting a national objective because we didn't collect the right data. We've had that be an issue in the past. We don't want it to be an issue because that means that money gets paid back to HUD because there's no national objective. So it's really important when you're setting up your activities to make sure that you set it up in a way that you can track the data that needs to be reported. And that's why we want to make sure that we're doing these trainings, but also that we encourage folks to talk with us if they have any questions about their national objective. So LMA reporting. So there's quite a few pieces of data that need to be included for LMA reporting. Fortunately, LMA is not by individual, right? So this is for an area benefit. If you're using the census data, it's pretty straightforward. You need your county code, census tract numbers, and your block group numbers. And then you need to know your total residential population, your total low-income population, and the total number of people with new and improved access. Oftentimes, that total number of people with new and improved access is the total population, right? If you did a street improvement and everybody has access to the street, then everybody has improved access. But sometimes it's a little more focused than that. You know, if you're doing an improvement to a specific public facility, maybe say one that just serves persons with a disability, we'll need to take a look at your data to make sure that we're capturing that new and increased access. If you're doing a code enforcement type of activity, you need to also be tracking how many violations are coming out of the code enforcement activity, and then how many units are being repaired or having repairs assisted with CDBG funds. Because you want to make sure that you capture that information has to be reported to HUD. The number of code violations is super important, so you'll want to make sure that when you set up your program, you set it up to track that information for that area. So low and moderate income housing activities. So your household has to earn less than 80% of HAMP fee. There's quite a few different activities that can be done under this housing assistance type of national objective. So you can do housing rehabilitation, and that can be both for rental units and for owner-occupied units. You can do homebuyer assistance programs. Homebuyer assistance is a little tricky with CDBG because there's actually some pretty strict limits. So if you're thinking about doing that, you'd want to talk with us first. For renter-occupied housing projects, you can do big multifamily rehabilitations. And we see a lot of times those come in paired with tax credits or similar, so you can actually go in and rehab a multifamily unit with CDBG. Other types of housing programs, you can do housing counseling, you can do code enforcement as we talked about. You can also do infrastructure in support of housing. So if you're going to be doing a housing development or if you're going to be rehabbing or adding units and you need to up the infrastructure, you know, that's something that's eligible for CDBG. What you can't do is construct new units. You can acquire land, you can do demolition and clearance, but you can't construct a new unit. CDBG is not intended for new unit construction. There's one caveat to that, but that is such a unique circumstance that we're not going to get into it and make it confusing. For our situation, for our situations, you can't construct new housing. You can reconstruct. You can do housing reconstruction as part of housing rehabilitation. So if there was a unit and it was destroyed in a fire or it had to be knocked down because it wasn't safe, and it was fairly recent, you can turn around and reconstruct the unit. Again, if it happened 10 years ago, that's not fairly recent. It's going to make it very difficult to prove that you're reconstructing anything and that wasn't just now vacant land. But no new construction. Questions? Okay. So for reporting on the low and moderate housing national objective, you need to know a few details. You're going to need to know your property addresses. So if you're doing housing, like single family rehabilitation, multifamily rehabilitation, single home buyer activities, anything like that, you need to be tracking the address of each unit that you assist. You'll need to know your household, race and ethnicity for each household. You need to know household size for each household. You need to know if the housing was built before 1978. You need to know household income, of course. If the house, let's talk about this 1978 thing real quick. So if housing that was built before 1978 potentially has the risk of having lead-based paint in it. Lead-based paint was outlawed in 78, no more putting lead-based paint in housing. But before that, lead-based paint was fairly common. If a home was built before 1978, there needs to be some sort of evaluation as to whether or not lead-based paint is going to be an issue in the activity. If they're going to be doing rehab, then the amount of effort that needs to be put towards addressing lead-based paint is based on the amount of money that's going to be spent on the rehab. So best practices, if it's if you're doing less than $5,000 on rehab, then you have to just use best practices in addressing lead-based paint. Oftentimes that's plastic, painting over, cleanup, wet vac, make sure everything's clear. Lead-based paint has to be tested before and after, so it's after your project is done. There's a test to make sure that the unit is clear. If you're doing between $5,000 and $25,000, there's an interim or controls. That's typically paint stabilization. That means you paint over everything, wet vac everything, make sure everything gets wiped down. You still have to pass clearance. If your project is more than $25,000, federal standards require abatement. Abatement is often a very, very big project. You'll want to talk with us before you get started. And we'll make sure we'll set you up in the right path. So low and moderate job creation and retention. So this is for those economic development projects. When you're setting up your program, you need to remember that at least 51% of the jobs have to be for low and moderate income persons. So you need to be providing jobs for the low mod households, the low mod persons in the community. The expectation is that for every $35,000 of grant funds that you spend, you're producing at least one FTE equivalent job. That's a lot of jobs for that grant money. Yes?
Does that number, I've never in the 15 years that I've seen that number change. Do they ever reevaluate that number?
The question is, has that $35,000 ever changed? Not in the time that I have been working with this. There are two standards. There's an individual project standard and then there's an aggregate standard. But because of the way that most programs are actually operated, you have to work with the aggregate standard. And especially in the state of California, you're not going to get jobs for less than $35,000 per. I mean, it's a very difficult standard to meet. Economic development is the most risky activity you can take with your CDBG dollars. If you are intent on it and you really need it, talk with us very, very early on in your project development. Yes?
For the 35,000, is it still allowed to do the 35, it's equal one job, but can it be 2 part-time jobs?
Yeah, so the question is, what kind of job structure do you have to have in order to meet that 35,000? And really, it's the equivalent of a job. So it can be, 2 part-time jobs can equal 1 full-time job. It's that equivalent of the 40-hour-a-week full-time experience. There's a lot of different activities you can do under economic development. There's actually quite a bit of variety. There's rehabilitation, there's facade improvements, there's financial assistance. The one activity where you sometimes don't have to meet that low mod jobs requirement is in your micro enterprise. If you're providing loans to a micro enterprise, then you're actually going to be tracking on race, ethnicity, and income. So that's a little bit different. But those programs require a lot of administration. Economic development programs, as a rule, require a lot of intensive administration. If you want to do it, talk to us, because they're complex and we really need to make sure that you set it up correctly. Our last round of monitoring, where we found the biggest errors, were in economic development projects, and the money that had to be repaid was from economic development activities. And we don't want money being repaid. We want money getting spent. So that's on that. Here's the reporting for it. So what you'll need to report if you're going to be doing an economic development style activity: the number of businesses that you help, whether they're new or existing. If you're doing facade improvements or rehabilitations, you need to track on those. And those require kind of the same information as that housing data, which would be specific addresses and then all of the job data. The number of full-time equivalent jobs created or retained. The number of low mod jobs. So You'll need to know total number of jobs and how many of those went to low-mod individuals. Weekly hours, total weekly hours for low-mod. Type of jobs. So HUD has kind of a unique set of definitions for the different types of jobs that you're tracking on. So we need to make sure we know what type of job you're doing. And then again, race, ethnicity, and income. Questions? Okay. So that is the beginning of this adventure in CDBG for today. Why don't we go ahead and take a 10-minute break, everybody get a chance to get some water, use the restroom. Again, badges over on the table, and we'll see you in 10.